in understanding education. This week we're looking at educational philosophy. Before we move on to educational philosophy, I just want to do a quick recap of what we covered last week in the face-to-face session. So last week we talked about the meaning of education, what do we mean by that, and why education is important. And we discussed how it's not universally fixed, it's a complex and likely to vary over time, and not the same for all of us, it might vary, and different people have different views on this. We also discussed the different sociological perspectives on the purpose of education. We discussed the functionalist approach, which consisted of the development of basic academic skills, how it could be for social control and maintain social order, education that is. It can prepare people for work. We also discussed the rhetoric of consensus and conflict theories. The rhetoric of consensus is an awareness or understanding that agreements are held, but not everyone will necessarily agree with those agreements. Therefore, what is good for one is not necessarily good for another, and it doesn't take into consideration power differentiations. We also discuss conflict theories and education benefits us all, but does it really? And we discussed how dominant ideologies can often support each other and not those of all. And just to recap, we also discussed ideologies and different educational ideologies. So the systems, broad beliefs and values about the nature of the world are termed ideologies. You might have your own values and beliefs. These are your ideologies. Ideologies are relevant to all areas of life and are often related. These could be linked to legal beliefs, order, political life, and the economic system. For example, you might believe in legalising certain types of drugs, while other people might be against this. You might believe in one political party, but others might differ. You might also believe that wealth should be shared more greatly, or we should all have the opportunity to develop our own wealth. It is evident that our ideologies would differ. And we also have these in education. The educational system has a purpose of social responsibility and for transformation. But now we'll just recap some of those significant ideologies that we discussed. We discussed different educational ideologies, and we know that they're based upon our beliefs on what we consider as important and what needs transforming. But we also know that the national curriculum and what is taught in schools will often be dictated by certain policymakers. Okay. So we looked at some of the key work of the main philosophers, and we looked at the work of Plato, who believed that humans are naturally predisposed to perform certain tasks based on their innate abilities, so the intelligence they're born with. So that key word is innate. He also proposed there was a hierarchical society in which individuals are assigned to different social class based on that natural ability they're born with. And we also looked at Hobbes, and he had a slightly different viewpoint on education, and he believed that education was important to maintain social order. So Plato was focused on that, we had these natural born abilities, and that is what our limits should be. Where Hobbes didn't necessarily have that view, but education was important to make sure that we had good behaviour, to prevent chaos. While Plato and Hobbes had different approaches to education, both recognised its importance. So in some ways they both agree that education is really important, but what they wanted education to do was different. Whereas one was focused on wisdom and moral virtues. We also discussed the work of Rousseau, who was from the Romantics period in the 18th century, where he suggested that the power of meaning is in your hands. And if we don't create change, those in power reinforce their position, which results in tyranny. So people are increasingly oppressed, and which could lead to violent uprisings as they are oppressed and they struggle for their freedom. So he suggested that we need to educate fully people, and they needed to question authority. Discussion is needed. The more knowledge we have, the more we can contribute to society, and it gives us more freedom and more liberty in society. Whereas Plato saw these freedoms as dangerous. So educating required people need to question, we needed discussion, and it meant that more people could contribute to society. We also discussed how this plays out in schools, about how much freedom and rules we should have, and what would the education system be like if we didn't have rules. We have to have some rules. We talked about how we fun at first, and then it will cause significant problems. Okay. We also discussed the different types of ideologies in education. We talked about those that emphasise on the individual, those emphasis on knowledge, and those emphasis on society. Now I'm just going to stick with ideologies. Now for this module, one of the crucial parts is we will need to discuss what your ideology is, and you would discuss this in your presentation, which is the assessment method. So that's why we've been talking about those so far in week 1 and now in week 2. This week we'll spend a bit of time where you present your presentations on a modern history of schooling, and we'll talk about how the financial situation of the country at one time has impacted education and what it's meant. And we'll go through these different stages as talking about education, the first education systems in schools, the first time that everyone had to go to school, the first secondary schools, how this changed after the Second World War, and how we had the dismantlement of the tripartite system. And then we talk about the Educational Reform Act of 1988, and which meant for the first time everyone had a national curriculum. So now on to this week's topic, where we're going to talk about educational philosophy, and we'll start off by talking about what philosophy is and why this is important. We have ideology and now philosophy, two difficult, abstract concepts that we need to grasp. And again, these would be useful because you'll talk about these in your assessments. So that's one of the reasons why we're starting off with these topics, which are relatively challenging early on. Okay, so moving on to talk about what is philosophy, and you might have come across many different explanations of what it is. So what is philosophy? It's the investigation of causes and laws underlying reality. It's the inquiry into the nature of things based on logical reasoning rather than empirical method. A system of values by which one lives. So to develop that a little bit more, it quite literally means the love of wisdom. So in a broad sense, philosophy is an activity people undertake when they seek to understand fundamental truths about themselves and the world in which they live. What are their philosophies, and how these relate to each other? Philosophy is a systematic study of ideas and issues. So moving on more specifically to talk about educational philosophy, a philosophy about education requires systematic, critical thinking about educational practices. And a teacher's educational philosophy helps them, the educator, interpret, find meaning, and direct the work and the daily work of their classes. Excuse me covering that up a little bit there. Now, I appreciate that we are going through these relatively quickly, these complex terms, but now I think it's important to highlight the difference between ideology and philosophy. So last week we talked about ideology, and educational ideology refers to a set of beliefs, principles or values that guide or shape an individual or group. Again, I apologise for covering up some of the text there. Philosophy is a broader and more abstract concept. It deals with fundamental questions about nature of education, knowledge and learning. Now, when we discuss what the differences are between ideology and philosophy, it's confusing. So I'm going to stop discussing that right now, and in our face-to-face session, we're going to pick this up and come up with some examples so we can understand that much better. So moving on to about philosophy and teacher professionalism, all professions have philosophical underpinnings. Educational philosophy is one important aspect of teachers' professional knowledge. So a teacher's professional knowledge could be their ability to apply knowledge and understanding of teaching strategies to support development of different areas such as literacy or numeracy or different subject content. So now we're going to look at some of the traditional schools of philosophy. Now I think it's important to add, if you were to do a Google search or look in some textbooks or some journals, you will get different things that come up or different concepts about philosophy, so it can be quite confusing. But I want to look at 4 of the main ones to start off with, of the traditional schools of philosophy. So we've got idealism, and you might have come across this term before in your previous studies in further education or in your schooling. So idealism asserts the belief that, asserts that because the physical world is always changing, ideas are the only reliable form of reality. So it questions everything we're doing. So then we have realism also, which says the features of the universe exist whether or not a human being is there to perceive them. So that would be accepting a situation as it is and being prepared to deal with it as accordingly as you realistically find. So then we move on to pragmatism, which rejects the idea of an absolute. So there's an unchanging truth. Instead, asserts that truth is what works. So we might have a problem and we deal with it in a pragmatic way with the best method to fix that problem. And then finally we move on to the term existentialism, not an easy one to say or understand. It says that humanity isn't part of an orderly universe, so not everything sits neat and tidy as we'd like it. So rather, individuals create their own realities of what they see. So from an existential philosophical belief, it suggests that we are responsible for creating meaning in our own lives. So our individual purpose and meaning is not given to us by gods, governments, teachers, or local government, and we interpret them from ourselves. So just to remind you, these terms are challenging to understand, and we will be spending some time looking at these and some other concepts within our taught face-to-face session. Philosophy and cultural minorities. The philosophies that we embrace are influenced by the cultures we live in. Western philosophy heavily emphasises individualism and rational thought, but other cultures from around the world place greater emphasis on the wisdom of elders, feelings and personal relationships, and harmony. It would be interesting to discuss your own beliefs on this and experiences you might have come across. So now I want to move on to some of the basic philosophies of education. I just want to say this is about my 20th take of trying to get this slide right. So thank you for persevering with me. And the ones that we're going to discuss in class include perennialism, essentialism, behavioralism, progressivism, existentialism, and postmodernism. Now, if you do have time, you might want to spend some time doing some research on that, but we will be spending some time in our face-to-face session this week of doing that. Now, just for the video, I'm going to stop talking, but I'm going to show the slides that we'll be covering, so you can stop the video here if you wish, or you can remain online watching the video.